Hello and welcome to the Raise Your Voice podcast with Brian Soy. My guest today is Todd Henry. Todd teaches leaders and organizations how to establish practices that lead to everyday brilliance. He is the author of 3 books, The Accidental Creative, Die Empty, and his new book, Louder Than Words. Louder Than Words captured my attention simply in the title alone. Todd wrote this book as a guide to teach others how to develop an authentic voice that resonates and creates impact. So, Todd, I want to first start off with a music reference. When you close your Accidental Creative podcast, well, first, I'm sorry. Let me say good morning, Todd.
Good morning. I like it. I like the let's dive in. I love that. That's great.
Yeah, let's just get to the point here. So thanks for joining me today. So I want to start off with a music reference, and I love this. When you close your Accidental Creative podcast, which has been my running companion for a long time, and it still is as I'm training for a marathon, you often say, cover bands don't change the world. So how did that thought influence your writing of Louder Than Words?
Oh, in significant ways. It's funny because this is the 3rd book that I've written in the last maybe 6 years, but I kind of feel like this is where I began 10 years ago. I'm kind of coming full circle with some of the thoughts and themes and whatnot. And this theme of voice has kind of been a bit of a through line or a thread that's run through all 3 of my books, I think, in many ways. That phrase, cover bands don't change the world, frankly, I've caught a little bit of flack for that because people will often say, well, what about the Beatles? The Beatles were a cover band. Really? So if the Beatles had stayed in Germany or in Liverpool playing Chuck Berry covers, do you think that we would be talking about them today? Do you think that Paul McCartney would still be filling stadiums today if he was playing Chuck Berry covers, from 50 or 60 years ago? The reality is, yes, they honed their skills. They developed their chops as cover bands, no questions about that. And then many other bands did as well. But at some point, they began to make intuitive leaps. They began to do their own thing, to write their own music and create their own space in the market. And so when I say cover bands don't change the world, what I mean is some people are perfectly content with the temporary attention, the temporary success that comes with just emulating other people, putting something out there that people will respond to in the moment, but that ultimately doesn't really move the needle. But that is not how brilliant contributive work is done over time. Cover bands don't change the world. People who have the courage to develop their own voice and to step out into places that might be a little bit tenuous, might be risking rejection, might be risking people pointing fingers and shooting arrows at them, but it's the people who are willing to do that ultimately move the needle and change the world. I don't know about you, but that's what I want my work to do. I don't want my work to be simply reflective of my influences. I want it to be something that weaves those influences into something new, something contributive. So that's really kind of the meaning of that phrase. I've been using it since 2005, and I think it's kind of been the through line for a lot of my work.
Sure. Yeah, and I recognize that you're really cognizant of where you've come from and where you're going. And what I'm hearing you say is that you want to create something that makes an impact and makes a difference and leaves its mark. So when you were just talking, you mentioned the word courage. And what do you think it really takes to be courageous in having a voice and doing what you're talking about doing in Louder Than Words?
Well, to be courageous, I think, means doing the right thing, even when it's the uncomfortable thing, And I think we often think that courage is something that's baked into a lot of people, where they're just courageous people. But the reality is, I think that it's not the case. That many of the people I meet who are very successful, very brilliant contributors are not intuitively courageous, so that they choose courage over comfort. And I think that's what we have to do. I think we have to choose courage over comfort. We have to be willing to do things that are, in the moment, might feel really scary to us, might make us feel like we're going to be rejected or cast out of society or made to feel like a fool. We have to be willing to do those things in the short run so that we can have the results that we want in the long run, which means taking intuitive leaps with our work and being willing to do that, even though there may not be a net immediately apparent beneath us. Now, it doesn't mean, by the way, taking stupid risks. And I think that's often why people discount this kind of advice or this kind of, this kind of book like Louder Than Words, because they think, well, what you're telling me is just follow your heart and take blind leaps into the unknown and everything will work out. No, that's the worst thing you can do, right? You want to be disciplined and diligent and work and develop and cultivate your skill set, cultivate your sense of identity, cultivate your vision for your work. And then when the moment presents itself, you'll be prepared to make an intuitive leap. It's not the kind of thing where you're just jumping blindly into the unknown. And so, I love Steve Martin Steve Martin, the comedian, Steve Martin, the novelist, Steve Martin, the screenplay, screenwriter, Steve Martin, the actor, Steve Martin, the bluegrass banjo player, right? I mean, this guy has reinvented himself so many times in his career. And in his book, Born Standing Up, he says, he talks about his path to becoming a great stand-up comedian. And he said, I didn't strive valiantly against the doubters. Instead, my progress was incremental, studded with a few intuitive leaps. Right? He says my progress was incremental. He cranked and worked and developed his craft. And then every so often he would make an intuitive leap. And some of those leaps paid off and some of them didn't. But it was his willingness to make those intuitive leaps that ultimately defined him as an artist. And that's what we have to do if we want to develop our voice and create resonant impact in the marketplace.
Yes, I agree. And I just, everything you say, I agree with. It resonates with me. And, of course, you were very kind in writing a short endorsement for my book, which talks about raising your voice. And that's why I really felt that these two books are almost like twin sons of different mothers in a sense.
They are. It's funny because I was also talking with Jeff Goins about this yesterday, who was another writer. He wrote a book called The Art of Work. And it's funny how so many of us are kind of exploring similar themes at the same time. I think we're feeling this thing in the marketplace, right? That people are struggling with, how do I separate myself from the noise? How do I differentiate myself? How do I position myself in a way that's unique? And I thought you did a brilliant job with that in Raise Your Voice. And I think it is kind of fun to see. I do think they're kind of sister books in a way.
Yes, well, thank you. And the one thing that came to me, I think, in chapter 2, and I have read the whole book. I highlighted that early edition, so I think I'm going to have to go back and highlight my release copy. So I'm going to reread it again. But what you talk about really speaks to legacy. And because this is not a short-term endeavor. You can't just wake up one day and say, hey, I'm going to reinvent myself.
Right. Yeah. And I think legacy, the challenge with legacy is that your legacy is something that is backward engineered by somebody else after you die, right? Somebody is going to invent a story about you based upon what they see. And, that's what's going to be your legacy, is the kind of the story that other people invent about you. I am profoundly less interested in legacy than I am about impact. And I think the best way to ensure that you're creating an impact that really lasts is to make sure you're approaching every single day consistent with the kind of impact that you want to have, right? And ensuring that you're not leaving your best work inside of you. Your legacy, I believe, is your body of work, and your body of work is any place you add value in your life. It's any place that you make a contribution that wasn't there previously. So it's not just your job. That's the most physical manifestation of your body of work, because it's the most apparent one. It's the one we spend most of our time doing. But it's also things like how you treat your family, how you lead your family, how you spend your money, where you put your finite attention, the kinds of problems you choose to solve, how you develop yourself, how you cultivate a sense of curiosity and wonder and sharpen your mind and your physical self, All of these things are part of your body of work. And at the end of our lives, we're all going to point to a delta, a sum total of value that we've created. And we're going to ask, does that reflect me, or does that reflect everyone else around me? Does that reflect my courageous decisions in the moment, or does that reflect my succumbing to the forces and the pressures of people around me who just wanted me to do the expedient thing, not the right thing? And so I think if we approach our days, Brian, with more mindfulness about the choices that we're making, and instead of listen, there are circumstances that we all have. There's circumstances that cause us to feel trapped or impeded or, like we have limited options. And the reality is that there are some circumstances, health-related issues. There obviously are macro socioeconomic issues that can cause significant problems for people in terms of really being able to enact what it is they want to do. But I believe that our body of work ultimately is marked by not our circumstances and not by how amazing everybody around us thinks the work that we do is, but how we choose to approach our life and our work. So I've met many brilliant janitors in my day, and I'm being very forthright about that, brilliant, amazing, contributive janitors, and I've met many mediocre CEOs, and I won't name them for you, but I've met many mediocre CEOs who everybody around them points to what they're doing and say, wow, look at that, that's amazing. But you know what? Their life is in shambles. They're miserable. They're mean to everybody around them. Nobody likes working with them. And basically they're counting the days until they can pull that ripcord on the golden parachute and go, sit by the beach in Florida. And to me, that's a really sad way to approach life. And yet I've met many people who have menial jobs, the kind of job that none of us would want to do, but they have a great attitude and their family is healthy and together, and they do their job so they can go home and build their body of work, right? Which is their family, which is serving their community, being a part of their community. So I think we each have to have the courage to say, you know what, I'm not going to listen to the forces in culture that are pulling me left and pulling me right. I'm going to run my race. I'm going to do the work that's in front of me. I'm going to pour myself fully into that and choose to do the courageous thing, even when people around me think I'm crazy, because it's more important that I build my body of work than it is that I build a body of work everybody else points to and says, oh, wow, look how amazing that person is. And that might mean compromising a little bit of short-term attention so that you can achieve a lot of long-term impact. But I think in the end, that trade-off is well worth it.
Yes, and that's for me, the idea of legacy is impact that lasts. So
yes.
It's really very much in line with what I think that is.
Yes.
I love this idea of run your own race. This speaks really personally to me, and I think it's the one thing out of the book that I wrote down a lot of things too, but run your own race. And I am not the fastest runner when it comes to marathons. Yet I have a friend who's always encouraged me to run with him, and he runs these crazy 6 to 8 minute miles.
Wow.
And I'm 9 to 10. But he's always there, and it makes me always feel like I'm running in the shadow of giants. When I get to run with somebody who's just a very accomplished runner, instead of taking that as I'm not good enough, it's a reminder. I need to run my own race. I need to look at the finish as well as at the road ahead of me at the same time.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful analogy that you pulled out in the book, and a great lesson.
It's funny you mentioned running with giants, because one of the things that Stephen Akhmatovich said to me, probably almost 10 years ago now, in an interview I did with him about his book Free Play, is he said, it's great to sit on the shoulders of giants, but don't let the giants sit on your shoulders, because there's no room for their legs to dangle, right? And I think that sometimes our influences can become burdens to us. It's great to sit on the shoulders of giants. It's great to be influenced by other people who are doing amazing things. But when you start to allow your influences to become burdens, or the people that you see around you doing great work to become an inhibitor of you doing work because you're artificially escalating your expectations, or you're trying to run somebody else's race. Like I'm sure, Brian, if you tried to keep up with your friend who's running 6 minute miles in a marathon, and you're trying to keep up, you're probably going to keep up for a while, because you run, you've got it, you're in decent shape. But after a while, you're probably going to fall off. You're not going to be able to keep the pace anymore, and you may not even finish the race because you've spent yourself in a manner that you're not able to do. And so many people do that, unfortunately. And I see this in the marketplace, and people, especially early in their career, they take off like a rocket, boom, and they're out of the gate, and they're running, and they're sprinting. And then after about 5 or 6 years, sheer youth and energy fails them, and they fall flat, they burn out, and they get bitter, and they get frustrated, and they get stuck. They're stagnant because they haven't built disciplines into their life to help them sustain over the long run. I am way more interested in the person who is contributing in a greater manner, in a more authentic and holistic manner when they're 55 years old than somebody who's doing that when they're 25 years old, right? Because that person has figured something out. That person has figured out how to continue to contribute, how to continue to be engaged. And frankly, like I mentioned before, a lot of people by the time they get later in their career are starting to think, when do I get to pull the ripcord? But I love it when I see people who are at 55 with a new business idea, and they're thinking, I can't wait. This is going to be the next 20 years of my life, right? I think that's amazing.
Yeah, and I concur. We ourselves, my wife and I, own this design firm, and we had the opportunity when our lease came up to either find another lease or buy a small office condo. And I'm close to that 55-year-old age you mentioned, and we decided we're going to buy it. And because I've got another 15, 20 years of impact that I want to make, and it was very conscious part of our decision that we're doing this because we're going to make a long-term impact, not just wait for the day of building and contents for sale and like you said, sit on the beach.
Yes.
So one of the words that you mention in the book is manifesto, and that word for me carries a lot of weight. Having spent a couple of years writing a manifesto that first I thought was going to be a manifesto that others could adopt, and it turns out it became and is my manifesto. It's long. But why did you choose that particular word, and what about a manifesto makes it so compelling?
Manifestos are active. It's impossible to read a manifesto and not say I'm in or I'm out. And I think that the reason that word, rather than, a mission statement or a vision statement, a vision statement or a mission statement doesn't really have the same level of urgency as a manifesto. A manifesto is active. It forces you to say, I'm either going to choose yes or I'm going to choose no. But the one option you don't have is to sit stagnant on the sidelines. A vision, you can always say, well, I'll get around to that later, right? Or a mission, well, I have a long time to do that. But a manifesto says the time is now. And so, and this has been a very effective tool for me. It's been effective for people I've used it with organizations I've used it with, because it forces you to consider what is so important to me that I'm not willing to wait to act upon it. Manifestos are active things. My company, the Accidental Creative podcast, and my company, Accidental Creative, started with a manifesto. It started with a personal manifesto where I said, all right, here are the things I believe, and therefore here's what I need to do about that. And that was, over a decade ago now, but that was the beginning of everything. For me and for my work and for my business. So a manifesto can have a very powerful impact on your life and on your ability to mobilize around what's important to you, because it has a way of clarifying the impact that you want to have.
Mm-hmm. Has your manifesto changed?
It has, yeah. And some of the things that I held on to early are a little different now. My intended audience has changed a little bit, which is interesting. I started out when I was first doing this work really targeting artists and designers and writers and people who were making art every day, because that was really my experience, right, was leading those kind of people. And I very quickly realized, and that's why even the terminology, the accidental creative, and all of these things came about, because I realized very quickly that there are way more creatives in the marketplace who are in need of this message than just artists and designers and whatnot. And frankly, they're under a significant amount of oppression by organizations that want to squeeze efficiency out of them at the expense of great work. And so, within a matter of a few years of launching, I realized the market is far broader, and it's been pretty fun to see how that enthusiasm and that clarity of targeting that intended audience now has really broadened the message and caused it to appeal and amplify in ways I didn't anticipate. But it all began with a manifesto. It all began with a very clear and precise sense of what it was I wanted to create in the world.
Yeah. So interesting. You're indicating that it's okay as we're developing our authentic voice to change our intended audience that we're speaking to, or even a narrower audience.
Right. Well, and that's what often happens. I think often you start with an audience and then you realize, oh, actually, my real audience is a subset of that audience. I think that's typically the way it does go. I think because my experience was so acute, I think that I started very niche and realized, no, actually, it's broader than that. The need is broader than that. But I think for a lot of people, I think they have to start maybe more broad and narrow it down over time. So that may be unique to me in terms of how that worked out. But but listen, I think your intended audience will change over time. I have had a different, quote unquote, intended audience for each of my books. It's the same, they're targeted the same demographic, the same psychographic. But when I talk about intended audience for my books, whenever I'm creating a long arc project, work of art or something, I have one specific person in mind that I'm creating that for. One person, not a group, not a demographic, not like one specific person, because that allows me to cultivate empathy in how I write. It allows me to imagine locking arms and walking with that person through the muck and the mire. And so that person has been different for each book, but it has been a very specific person, not a group of people. And it's funny because so many people come up to me, Brian, and they'll say, this book feels like, did you put a camera on my office wall? Have you been following me around? I think the reason that people feel that often when they read my books is because they sense the precision with which I'm writing, because I am. I'm speaking to one person. I'm writing as if that person is across the desk from me, and I'm saying these things to them. And so I think that helps cultivate a sense of precision and consonance. And if we want our message to resonate, we have to define that intended audience, and then we have to cultivate precision. That intended audience has to be able to say, I'm in or I'm out. So your message has to cut. It has to be very precise, which many people don't want to do. They want to be very fuzzy because they want to include everybody. But you can't do that, right? And it has to be consonant, meaning it has to be internally consistent. It has to resonate within itself. You can't be all over the place. And when you have a very specific intended audience, it's really difficult to bounce from here and there and everywhere, because if you do that, they're going to ignore you and walk away. So it forces you to be consonant when you're very precise about your intended audience.
So, Todd, that you kind of answered my next question, but when you say you're writing for a specific person, which is great advice for any writer, have you met that person? I mean, you have people coming up to you, in a sense, self-identifying, but have you met the person that you were writing for?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I know all of the people. I know them personally. That's why I was able to write to them, because I know them personally. I have sat across the desk from them. I have at some point, maybe even shared some thoughts or insights with them or helped them through issues they were dealing with. So yeah, I know these people. That's why it's easy for me to write to them. But I also know that what they're struggling with is reflective of what a lot of people are struggling with. The problem is that when we take that and we extrapolate, and we sort of magnify that across a demographic, and we turn it into a more sort of generic audience, we don't write or create or make things with the same, or communicate with the same level of empathy, I think, because we're trying to sort of we're turning them into an avatar rather than a real person. And so we see this, and companies do this, and I know this can be really valuable to do that, to have shopping Susie or super executive Susie, or Joe the whatever. Like we have these like avatars that we target things toward, and that can be really helpful to do that. But I think that at the end of the day, a lot of times what that causes us to do is kind of water down and make assumptions about our audience. So when we're very precise, I think it takes a lot of that guesswork out of it.
Yes, yeah, and in the web design work that we do, or sometimes the marketing work we do, we call those personas.
Yep.
And they do tend to become generalizations. And I understand your point about writing for a specific person. About 3 weeks ago, I was contacted by a prospective client, and he spent something like 20 hours on our website reading everything. And when I talked to him, I realized, you're the one I wrote the book for. And
right.
and now then I was writing something else, and I started writing it with him in mind, and it still took a long time to write, maybe 300 words, if that, because I wanted it to be really concise, but I kept him in mind, and it just made such a difference thinking that I'd be sharing this with him, and he would just read and go, yeah, exactly, let's go.
Right. That's what happens, right? When we're very precise, that often that's the response, and we often get the results and the resonance that we want.
Yeah. So those are great insights, and I want to thank you for your time. And if you're interested in learning more about Todd Henry and about the new book, Louder Than Words, you can visit toddhenry.com and learn more about his company, The Accidental Creative, at accidentalcreative.com. And Todd's on Twitter at Todd Henry and on Facebook as well. So, Todd, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I'm going to listen to this about 10 times because it's such a great way of condensing all your thoughts. And I think I needed to hear this myself today just as much as having the opportunity just to talk to you has been great.
Thank you, Brandon. What's funny is that so often as I'm speaking, I'm sort of indicting myself as well. So I need to go back and listen to it as well because, listen, I think we all need these reminders and these sort of swift kicks in the rear every so often to keep us moving in the right direction. So thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you allowing me to share with your audience today.
Yep, my pleasure, and thank you again for your time, and best wishes on the success of Louder Than Words.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Raise Your Voice podcast from Brian Soy. If you're interested in learning more about how you can find and raise your authentic voice, or to become a member of the Changemaker movement, visit causemanifesto.com. Be sure to look for the book, Raise Your Voice, A Cause Manifesto, a guidebook for leaders who desire to align their communications through purpose, strategy, and to mission-driven design on Amazon.com.